Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Melissa and today I'm sharing my doll carriage makeover. So this carriage I've had for quite some time, and I recently noticed that the fabric was fading and that the basket that the doll sits in seemed to be kind of sinking a little, and it was causing the ruffles to pull up and into the carriage instead of out and sitting the way they were supposed to. And while I was at it, I also figured I would give it a more neutral color palette because the blues and all were a little too bright for me, although they did match the outfit of the doll that was in it very well. And yes, that really is a doll. The first step was removing all of the fabric pieces from the frame. And the basket part was just mostly tied on with strings underneath the ruffles. So that was easy enough to undo. And then the shade had to come off in order for the basket to come out the rest of the way, which was fine because that had to come off anyhow. I could not get the bolts undone by myself, so I did have to call in reinforcements, in other words, my parents. Once Dad had the shade off, it was then that I looked around and started to have doubts. It would be really sad if this carriage has survived for like 20 some odd years and just doesn't survive this makeover. But everything was already in pieces, so I pushed on ahead and started by pulling my fabric. Now, I was just using some fabric from my stash. I had some ivory satin left over from a dress and some white sheer voile that was left over from multiple different projects. So I took the original basket and sat down and measured all of the pieces to determine what sizes I need. I ended up cutting 2 long rectangles and 2 short rectangles for the sides of the basket, and 1 long rectangle cut on the fold for the bottom of the basket. And that piece was cut on the fold because I was going to sandwich a piece of plastic in between it, which I had cut out of the bottom of the original basket. So the first thing I did in constructing the basket was to take the bottom rectangle and fold it in half, serge it on 2 sides, and slip the plastic sheet into it. And then I serged that last edge closed. And at this point I started having even more doubts because the sheet seemed very tight in that pocket. Like there was going to be very little room for a seam allowance, even though I knew that when I had cut it giving room for that seam allowance, like based on the size of the finished original basket plus the seam allowance. So it should have been looser than it was, but it wasn't, and I really didn't have much more extra fabric left, so I didn't have the luxury of just cutting it out again. So I kept going. The next thing I did was serge all of the sides of all 4 sides. So each rectangle for the sides, I serged on all 4 sides of that rectangle. And then I stitched the sides to all the ends of the bottom rectangle, making sure to be very careful on the long sides because I didn't want to put my needle through that plastic. Next was taking the basket from a flat shape into a 3D shape. So on each side, I lined them up to each other and stitched them down, turning it into kind of a corner on the basket. Repeated that on all of the sides and had more of a basket. I hope this makes sense in the visuals because I'm not really sure what else to call it. Basically, all of those corners were stitched together, turning it so that it stood up as a basket and not as a flat piece of material. For the ties, I used some leftover bias tape from another project, and I stitched them in half so that all the rodgers were on the inside and cut them to the length that I needed. And then tacked them on to the basket using the original piece as a guide for where they needed to go. Up next was the ruffle, and I used the sheer wall for this. I ripped out strips of fabric at 6 inches tall and took 2 long strips and 2 shorter strips for the sides. And the 2 long strips I actually did cut in half to make them into 4 slightly shorter strips, because in order for that ruffle to go around the shade, it needed to be split in the middle. So I finished 3 of the edges of these ruffles with a rolled hem on my soldier, and I left one of the long edges undone for the moment. I then gathered them up and attached them all the way around the sides of the basket. Then I serged that top edge again just to finish off the raw edges of the wall. I think the basket edges were already finished, but this just ensured that everything was done. And to cover up that serged edge, I then applied a lace trim all the way around. I wanted to put off working on the shade for as long as possible because, well, just look at it. So instead of working on that after I finished the basket, I went ahead and worked on the bedding. I took the mattress from the carriage out and cut a rectangle of satin fabric and wrapped it around the mattress and whip stitched it in place to cover it. I removed the ruffle from around the pillow and covered it the same as I did the mattress before adding some white lace around the edges of that. Then I cut a rectangle of crushed penne for a blanket. So with everything else done, I couldn't put off the shade any longer. So I removed it from the frame and looked at it closely. I kind of already thought it, but I have been hoping it wasn't the case, but it was made in 2 pieces. So my first thought was, I really don't want to do this, because trying to trace that shape, it wasn't wanting to lay flat because it also had ruffles on it. So my first thought was, do I really need a shade? Unfortunately to me, the carriage just did not look right without it. So I figured, what did I have to lose? I took some sheer wall and folded it in half, then flattened out the shade piece onto the fabric as much as possible before cutting it out, leaving a bit of a seam allowance. And since the wall was folded in half, that meant that I got 2 pieces. I then stitched those 2 pieces together along that center seam and serged it to finish those raw edges. I then used my serger again to finish the front, back, and sides of this piece with a rolled hem. Then I needed to create channels for the framework to thread back through. So I used more strips of sheer wall and placed one channel at the front edge, one at the back edge, and one over that center seam. I then also stitched lace in the same 3 spots, so the front edge, the back edge, and covering and hiding that center seam. Then threaded the structure pieces, the frame, back through it, and re-screwed it to the carriage. Overall, I think this makeover turned out very lovely. I like the more delicate look of the all-white carriage, and I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video, and I hope you will join me next time.